Well, Andy Williams and Max Harrison, political commentators, both are with me from different sides of the divide. Andy, you're involved in politics, aren't you, with Reform? Isn't that right?
Yes, no, I'm the chairman of the Faversham Mid-Kent branch, and was the
former candidate.
Yes, candidate in general election as well. Yes,
that's right. Well, great to have you both in the studio. We'll ask you a little bit later on whether you would travel 690 miles for a Nando's. Would you walk 500 miles? Mike has been in touch from Newcastle. He says, "Bring back Boris. At least he was entertaining." What we need is boring politics. We need boring. Make politics boring again. Yeah. That's my mantra. Yeah. Hopefully not in my reports from Conservative Party conference this week. Although you can be the judge of that. Let's just hear one more time from Boris Johnson and his thoughts on his apology for Partygate.
What I was trying to say there was, I think that the blanket apology, the sort of apology I issued right at the beginning, I think the trouble with it was that afterwards, all the accusations that then rained down on officials who'd been working very hard in Number 10 and elsewhere were thought that to be true. And by apologising, I had sort of inadvertently validated the entire corpus.
I get that, but
and it wasn't fair on those people.
Okay.
Well, that's Boris Johnson talking to Tom Bradby on ITV. All the clips we've had in the last sort of 25 minutes or so are from that interview, which is with ITV. Tom Bradby is their sort of main anchorman, and he was interviewing Boris Johnson there about the former Prime Minister's new book, which is called Unleashed. Unleashed, or for you, Andy, perhaps unread?
Unhinged. Boris Johnson is such a proficient liar, he's even managed to lie to himself and persuade himself that the reason he was brought down as Prime Minister is because of some sort of shady cabal of people who hated him, not because he was a liar and completely incompetent. And I think the one thing that we don't talk about...
Completely incompetent, fastest vaccine rollout in the Western world?
Yeah, I accept that was a success, and to be fair to him, credit where credit's due, he appointed
You called him completely incompetent in a minute.
Hang on. He appointed Kate Bingham, who did most of that work, but he appointed her, and we have to give him credit for that, fair enough. But actually, if you look at Boris Johnson's overall record as Prime Minister, it's really, really poor. There's not a legacy. They're, levelling up, which was a brilliant idea, and had it been delivered, would have been a really, really positive thing. None of it. I mean, actually, regions of the UK were more unequal after Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister than before.
Well, Labour scrapped it. They scrapped it from the name of the department. It was the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities.
Of course, because it's indelibly associated with him. But that's just a slogan. I mean, I think actually the policy of levelling up, Labour will deliver more so.
What about what Boris Johnson said there, where he said that he gave this blanket apology and that was wrong because subsequent things that came out he was then essentially apologising for, and there were lots of different accusations that were levelled at people in Number 10 during Partygate. What do you make of that?
Well, fundamentally, his government set the rules, and you could have a debate about whether his rules were right or wrong, but his government set the rules, and they didn't stand by them. Simple as that.
Max?
I actually have to agree, actually. I mean, Boris Johnson's biggest problem was he was Boris Johnson. He has a historicity of lying and not telling the truth, and eventually that does come up and catch you up. And I think, you look at the Johnson era, it is now full of scandal and sleaze, and this idea about the breaking of the rules in lockdown. If you are going to set rules, you have to follow them yourself. And this idea and this narrative of trying to blame other people, even trying to blame Sue Gray and saying that he was basically all a witch hunt, is actually quite silly.
And it's interesting, actually, with James Heal's point. I don't know if you heard James Heal's point when he made about 10 minutes ago, where he said that Boris Johnson actually originally said the Sue Gray report completely vindicated him, and now he's blaming her because she's gone to work for Keir Starmer. Is that unfair to Sue Gray, perhaps?
I do think it's a little bit unfair. I mean, don't get me wrong. I find it very peculiar, the relationship that Sue Gray might have had with the Labour Party.
And we don't know when that started.
Exactly, when those conversations were taking place. But it is an independent report. It did find him guilty of breaking the rules, and that's that. You can't complain.
As did the police. He got a fixed penalty notice. Maybe we're being unfair to Boris Johnson. Let me know what you think. 0344 499 1000. Tommy's on the phones today, and if you've never done it before, today's the day. Whatever's on the tip of your tongue about Boris Johnson or any other of the issues we're talking about, lockdown more generally perhaps, give me a shout. Give Tommy a ring. 0344 499 1000. You make your point. We get as many people on the air as we can between now and 1 o'clock. You know me, I love talking to people on the air. Quite a few comments about lockdown. Leslie says Bernard Jenkin held a party for his wife during lockdown. Several MPs attended, including the then Deputy Speaker. Yes, that was Dame Eleanor Lang. I think she's now actually Baroness Lang now. All got away with it. Why, says Leslie? Yeah, that investigation was ended into that, says Leslie. And there do seem to be some different rules for different people, and I think a lot of people feel quite annoyed annoyed about that. Michelle, we'll talk about the BBC in a second. Michelle says, I am gobsmacked at just how far the BBC have gone with broadcasting that wickedness. On Friday, Michelle is referring to the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a 40-minute uninterrupted speech from him broadcast by the BBC. Normalising it, says Michelle, the BBC are a disgrace and embarrassment as the world watches on at our demise. There are crazy, scary times in the UK for sure. Take care, says Michelle. Well, we'll come back to our panel about that issue and others here on Talk in just a minute. In Burnham-on-Sea has been in touch and says Boris Johnson could come back into politics, but he must drop his father and Carrie, his wife's obsession with net zero and all the green nonsense, says John in Burnham-on-Sea. Of course, it was David Cameron who talked about the green crap, as he put it, and that is in context, so take that off, Con. Mark in Sunbury says Boris Johnson and his government are guilty of a crime against humanity for locking down this country to mitigate the spread of COVID. They knew it was not necessary. If the lies are big enough, there is no punishment. And Bob in Chiswick in West London says it's time to grow up about Boris. All the people that have not got a good word to say about him are mostly vindictive Ramoners. Boris did not brew up COVID in a shed in the back of 10 Downing Street, and like the rest of us, he was trying his best to get through it. If someone brought a cake into the office where 60 people sat around with each other all day, it is a bit much. To criticise him in this way, says Bob. Look, he broke his own rules, Bob. It wasn't about people like, oh, he had a slice of cake. It's not about having a slice of cake. It's about breaking the rules that he set himself. Let's talk about the BBC now, because yesterday it broadcast for 40 minutes a rant, a broadcast, a speech from Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of Iran. And we asked the BBC why they decided to run this whole thing. I'm not saying they shouldn't have covered it. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have run perhaps a bit of it, put it in context, and then debated it and spoke in regard to its reporters and so on. But the vile anti-Semitism, the justification of the 7th of October, those horrendous attacks where Hamas terrorists burned people, maimed people, raped people, killed 1,200 people. Actually, I'm criticising the BBC, but there's an excellent documentary about it, about the Nova Festival, and part of it called We Will Dance Again, which I highly recommend. 90 minutes. Don't have any kids near you watching it. It's a very, very hard watch, but it's a brilliant watch. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen, actually. And we asked the BBC about this decision to broadcast this for 40 minutes. And the BBC press office told us the BBC News channel took rare footage from Iranian leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's first public speech since 2020 as part of analysis and scrutiny on the contents of the speech. As Iran's involvement in the conflict has intensified, it is important and editorially relevant to hear from the key players to aid understanding of developments. Our journalists, including colleagues from BBC Persian, provided context and explanation for audiences. I would slightly push back on the involvement in the conflict intensifying from Iran, certainly in terms of ballistic missiles, yes, but Iran has been all over this conflict from the start a year ago. Max, what do you make of this controversy?
I think it's, once again, living proof that the BBC is an absolute disgrace, and another reason why the licence fee has to be scrapped. It is absolutely abhorrent that this was allowed to go on air for 40 minutes, uninterrupted, and they can argue about the context. It was not like the speech was scrutinised and criticised afterwards. We should not be airing any justification for what happened on the October the 7th whatsoever. There is no defence for it. And again, it's just, once again, more proof that the BBC has been a little bit biased against Israel ever since last year.
Andy?
Do you believe in freedom of speech, Max?
Oh, absolutely, I believe in freedom of speech.
Well, not when you disagree. So it seems we shouldn't be broadcasting it because we don't like it. Look, I mean, what a load of nonsense.
But
the BBC...
Broadcasting hold on. Broadcasting it uncritically for 40 minutes. I'm not saying they shouldn't broadcast. I said that at the very start. I'm just saying that 40 minutes uninterrupted of anti-Semitic invective.
So let's unpack this. So firstly, the BBC's coverage of this and most foreign affairs issues and conflicts, show me a news organisation anywhere in the world that is covering any of these issues with the same expertise, in the same depth, investing the same amount of money, except it's public money, right? But there is no organisation, news organisation, anywhere in the world who is doing this to the same level. And I think the BBC statement hits the nail on the head, which is that it's editorially relevant to hear from a key player in the conflict. We can't just... Now, I am massively in favour of Israel's right to defend itself. October 7th was horrific. I am not defending Iran or Hamas or Hezbollah or anyone on that side of the argument. But it is, of course, relevant to hear from the other side. And I'm afraid the BBC's, people like Max, who are constantly laying into the BBC for not being balanced, well, this is an example of them putting both sides of the argument.
Well, but again, what you're missing is two conflations between freedom of speech and hate speech. And when you've got a rant which is full of anti-Semitism, that verges on hate speech, and it does, and clear as day.
Well, it is hate speech. I mean, he was attempting to justify the 7th of October. He was saying it was legitimate and justified.
So I think that's a fair point. But you have to understand, in order to understand complex issues, and this is one of the problems I have, is that some people are painting this situation as the situation in Gaza and everything that's happened over the last 12 months as very straightforward. Now, I think everyone in this room has roughly the same view about, who's on the right side of things. But that's not to say it's not complicated. And I think it is useful to hear from leader of Iran in this case, in the same way as it's quite useful to understand what's going on in Vladimir Putin's mind when we think about what's going on in Ukraine. I don't think we should say we should never hear from Putin.
No, I'm not saying, but we're not saying we shouldn't hear from them. We're not saying we shouldn't hear from them. We're saying that 40 minutes uninterrupted, translated out on this major channel. This is not just the domestic channel. This is right across the world, because they've merged BBC World News and BBC News. I mean, this is basically, they're basically broadcasting his words unedited and uncritically.
So that is an editorial decision that you may agree or disagree with.
Well, it's questionable, isn't it? It's questionable.
So you disagree with the decision. That is not a reason to say we should defund the BBC and it's a disgrace. That's just disagreeing with their editorial decision. In
the last year, it's almost the case that there's been 1,500 pieces of evidence of them breaching their own editorial guidance. And how the BBC can defend 40 minutes uninterrupted of this speech yesterday, when back in, a couple of months ago, they pulled out halfway out a speech of Nigel Farage, and the presenter said, we have to apologise for his
who's never on TV, by the way.
Inflammatory language. It just shows...
For which she apologised.
Yes, she did apologise, but that's because Nigel Farage asked the BBC to do so. But again, it just proves that the BBC does have its own agenda, does have its own bias, and if people want to watch that content, that's fine, but the British public and the taxpayers shouldn't be funding it. They should be paying for it.
But if the BBC didn't exist, if the BBC wasn't publicly funded, who do you think would be investing in this level of coverage with this depth of expertise? BBC Persian, they have a department that's dedicated to understanding Iran and the sort of Iranian diaspora.
But often what we've seen, and part of the critical report that was out a couple of weeks ago, was a number of journalists from BBC Arabic, for example, who have been very biased on this conflict. Now, you can talk about John Simpson, and, he hasn't really been covering it, but at least Doucette and various people like that, and Jeremy Bowen and so on. I mean, look, I would argue that sometimes they say things they shouldn't say, but the point is that there have been a number of breaches of the BBC's own editorial policy in terms of impartiality, and many people will see this and just see another one.
The BBC's falling over itself the whole time to try and be balanced, right? And of course they're not. Of course they're not. It is. Of course they're not going to get it right every time. I mean, this actually annoys me more than almost anything else in politics. I think it's an utter disgrace that Reform and everyone in Reform is trying to. You don't like it because it's straight down the line. And look, there is a place for talk and there is a place for GB News. I'm sorry. Yes, it is.
How can it is to you, because that's your worldview.
Absolutely,
it's your opinion.
I'm sorry. That is not the case.
So this week we saw Michelle Hussein on the Today programme not interrupting someone who was spewing vile anti-Semitic things and had to apologise for it. There's been a guest they banned and then brought back as well, who was saying things like that, who was saying that the 7th of October could be justified as well. There are a number of examples, even this week, in terms of how the BBC is not acting as it should. Michelle Hussein, one of the highest paid, most respected Today programme presenter, you don't get there without being a very, very experienced journalist.
Absolutely.
And she made a huge mistake this week.
Well, like I say, I think all of these conversations are very, very difficult. I think maybe you're projecting your biases about whether or not you think they're saying the right things. But the BBC, it's not the BBC's role to provide entirely uncritical coverage of Israel's
impartiality. Let me read a message here from Mary in County Down. He says, during the IRA bombing and slaughter campaign targeting Great Britain, killing children, if the BBC had run 40 minutes of Gerry Adams ranting anti-British rhetoric and justifying murder, the corporation would have been taken off air and closed down. Max?
And rightly so. You cannot allow any language going out there, the BBC has a responsibility to ensure that actually what is being put out there is in the safety and best interest of the British public. Then that's the justification.
Well, it's not the best interest.
No, it doesn't.
It's not about the best interest of the British public. It's about what is true and what is impartial and fair. It doesn't have to be in the best interest. We can say things that, you know, are not in the great. I mean, they do all sorts of coverage of all sorts of things which are detrimental to the
It
UK.
also, by the way, is allowed and should be broadcasting opinion as long as those opinions are balanced.
But when I say about in the best interest of the British public, it's about the promotion of things which also is right, fair, safe and reasonable. And having 40 minutes of this, you know, this hate speech yesterday is not reasonable, is not right, and there's no defence to it. And the BBC, they can claim what they want in their statement they gave to TalkTV. The point is, it shouldn't have been allowed on air, and if it's going to go on air, not 40 minutes uninterrupted, and have at least a serious critical analysis of it afterwards, taking it down like they would do if it was the case of Benjamin Netanyahu.
This is just an excuse to bash the BBC from people who will always find excuses to bash the BBC, and you don't like it.
You
don't like it because the BBC, because it has a responsibility to, and you know, things like BBC Verify, they call out people on the populist left and the populist right for the lies they tell the whole time. That's why you don't like it.
BBC Verify have got it wrong on a number of occasions. Benny in Belfast says the BBC has been telling us what it is long before the 7th of October, but the bias has been very obvious since then. It's ethically bankrupt. I was forced to pay for the Iranian leader's hate rant through my licence fee. I think we'll leave it there. We'll go to a break. We'll talk more about another serious issue in regard to woke exam chiefs banning problematic words, including immigration and homosexuality from papers, including the word medieval. Why? We'll find out next here on Talk. Peter has been in touch from Wiltshire, great name, says the BBC have become a left-wing, non-impartial organisation that I'm compelled to pay for or face a criminal prosecution. Laughable. Make it a subscription-based service, says Peter. Well, actually, the government are looking at decriminalising not paying your licence fee, to which asks the question, why would people pay it? Sue says the BBC has been showing political correctness and bias for years now. They focus on being nice instead of producing realistic and unbiased programmes. Sometimes that's the case, Sue. Sometimes I'll respectfully disagree with you, but I will defend some of it. But I do think there's a big issue with their Middle East coverage. Damien in Bristol says we will never give the BBC another penny on ethical grounds. We won't watch or use the service of terror supporters. Dave said, did the BBC broadcast Netanyahu's recent UN speech in full and around the world, or still waiting? Amanda says the BBC should hang their heads in shame, pandering to terrorists who wish us all harm and at the same time grossly insulting our decent patriotic British Jews. It seems the law against racism in this country doesn't apply against Jews, and outrage, says Amanda. Well, tomorrow actually we will be covering, it's almost exactly a year, it's a year on Monday, of course, from the 7th of October Hamas terrorist attacks, and we will be covering it in depth tomorrow, talking to people in Israel. And actually a number of people have contacted me on social media about Avivi, who is the hostage. She was a Hamas hostage. Her husband Keith is still being held a year on by Hamas terrorists deep underneath Gaza in horrendous conditions. She spoke incredibly movingly a few weeks ago, and people have been asking me how she's getting on. We're going to talk to her again tomorrow around this time, so do tune in from that. I'm on between 10 and 1. Let's talk now about staff getting more rights from the first day of work. More than 7 million people will gain rights to claim sick pay, maternity pay and protection against unfair dismissal from their first day in the job. This is sweeping new laws that Labour is introducing from Thursday. Good idea, Max?
I'm deeply concerned, particularly for business owners. I mean, don't get me wrong, employers and employees should have greater rights, and probably they do at the moment, but this is very worrying. I mean, let's take, for example, you know, the concept of, you know, work from home, that actually they're going to have to say yes. An employer is going to have to say yes to someone's request for working at home.
You can work at home very effectively. Some people do.
Some people do, some people don't. And that's the point. It's about, should be, an employer's choice to determine who actually...
Why the employer rather than the employee?
Well, no, because if employee can...
If you can't do it, if you can work from home effectively, look, some people are bone idle, and they're going to be bone idle whether they're in the office or whether they're at home.
Yeah, I mean, I formerly worked in the civil service, and I can tell you from my own personal experience...
How did you get on?
No, formerly, I did say formerly.
How long did you last?
6 months.
Right.
The point is... 6 months.
Those are about 5.5 months longer than I thought you might have lasted.
No, probably.
Max.
But no, again, but when I've been working it, and I did see my time there with my own eyes, I mean, those who could take the mickey in the system and work from home, they were never really that productive, and that's my concern, actually, the productivity of the United Kingdom.
I know some people who are very productive.
Hang on, the private sector sector is much more productive than the civil service.
For sure. Yeah, but no,
Andy, what do you make of this story?
Well, firstly, on the working from home thing, employers will just have to explain to employees why it's not reasonable for them to work from home. Frankly, anyone will be able to get around that. I mean, I know exactly. I'm looking at all of this through the prism of my team, and you know, I work for a consultancy. We have lots of young people in particular who maybe aren't used to doing 5 days a week in the office, and we've gone back to 4 days a week in the office, compulsory, for anyone who is client-facing, and I think that's been a good thing and the right thing to do. But I always think, what would my boss say in response to some of these things? Well, firstly, this right to switch off question that was in the ether.
Yeah, this is part of this, isn't this?
Well, no, it's been ditched.
Oh, has it?
Yes, they've actually abandoned it because they've looked at it, and rightly, in my view.
In France, they have it, don't they? So after 5 o'clock, 5:30 or whatever, your boss can't contact you to say, actually, what about the report? Will it be ready tomorrow morning? That sort of thing.
Correct.
What do you make of this as someone who is the boss of people?
Yeah, I mean, Labour was looking at this, and my view was that's just not workable in certain jobs, right? There might be some jobs. Again, it's a bit like the working from home thing. Yeah. It's horses for courses. In some jobs, it might be completely fair enough that actually after 5 o'clock you're kind of off the clock. But in my job, if you have clients, for example, it's not remotely feasible. You couldn't do your job properly. And I imagine my boss would be like, well, okay, if you don't want to be contacted after 5 o'clock, that's absolutely fine. That's the end of your progression, pay rises, etc., etc. That would have been the reality of that arrangement.
What do you make of this right to switch off idea, Max?
Well, I think, again, it depends exactly on the type of work which you're doing. But, and again, my concern with these proposals, a lot of them, is actually the power balance is going from the employer to the employee.
But that's been the case for a long time. We've got high levels, well, we do have high levels of unemployment, for example, but we also have a lot more power given to the employee. They have a lot more rights, and this is even more for them. And you're concerned about that, Max?
Well, I'm concerned about the consequences, not really the practicalities of it, but what it's going to do to productivity and to businesses in this country when already they're being hit, in my opinion, too hard as it is. So I think, some of them are sort of quite beneficial, but again, if you're entitled from sick pay on day one, again, my concern and my fear is that people are going to exploit the system.
The thing is that people do exploit the system. I mean, I remember working, when I was working alongside civil servants as a special advisor for 3.5 years, I remember there was one person who I heard about who basically, got to you'll presumably have experienced this in workplaces as well, got to sort of the final day where they could be dismissed or, brought in, or the last week or something, and then they would sort of come in that day and then go off on sick again. I mean, I know examples in the school system, for example, where people would actually time when they had children, so then they could come back in the last week of June in Northern Ireland to get their pay for July and August, for example. And that, I mean, there will always be people who do that. Exactly,
and the only system that can guard against that is not having a system at all. And I don't think that the majority of sensible people in this country would advocate taking an American-style approach to employment where you can just fire people left, right and centre, right? Some people might think that's a good thing. I personally don't think that would be a good thing.
Well, they don't have paid parental leave, for example, in the United States.
They have very few rights at all. I think it's 10 days statutory minimum of holiday.
Right. No, I have friends who have 2 weeks holiday. I have friends who want to travel, for example. Sorry, I shouldn't be talking about my international friends. I got criticised from this last week, but I have an American friend who loves to travel, and every time she travels, she saves up, leaves her job, and then gets another one when she goes back. She takes like a month off and then does that because she just can't get more than 2 weeks off in the whole year.
But I think here's the important point about this proposals is 2 things. Firstly, there's been an extensive consultation with business, with the CBI in particular, with the Institute of Directors as well, to make sure that these proposals are acceptable to business. And actually, from the original draft, which included a right to switch off and included sort of scrapping probation periods entirely, we've moved quite a long way, because Labour today versus Labour 5 years ago under Corbyn understands that the private sector is important and is consulting with businesses. The other thing I'd say is I'm hearing a lot of whining that sounds very similar to some of the things people were saying when the minimum wage was introduced. Now, the vast majority of people, apart from Kemi Badenoch by the sounds of it, think that the minimum wage is a good thing. In 1997, when Labour were looking to introduce it, people described John Prescott as a loose cannon. They said it would increase...
he was a loose cannon.
Well, that is fair enough. I have to give you that. They said it would increase unemployment. They said, Michael Heseltine said, union bosses are flexing their muscles, there's no stopping them, this will be the end, the economy's going to be ruined. It was the same outcry then.
OK, Max, final thought from you on this.
Well, and again, I totally disagree with it. It came embedded on the minimum wage. And again, we have got wage suppression in the United Kingdom. And again, it's important that whilst we've got a cost of living crisis and people are struggling with the pennies and pounds in their pockets, that we do support them. But again, just by adding more and more legislation, I don't think is the right answer to actually supporting employees. And again, looking forward to what, the autumn budget, etc., I don't think we can say that Labour is a business-friendly government. I think
unless you got 30 grand to pay for croissants with Jonathan Reynolds, who, we should say, the business secretary says he didn't know anything about that. I want to ask you another thing. This is woke exam chiefs removing problematic words such as immigration and homosexuality from papers, advising history teachers to avoid the term medieval. This is exam boards across the UK stripping out what they consider to be outdated terminology and decolonising syllabuses to make them more inclusive. Edexcel, one of the biggest boards out at some Edexcel exams, have branded a series of words including immigration, slave, Native Indian and Gypsy as problematic. I mean, people in the Gypsy Roma community call themselves Gypsy Roma. That's what they call themselves. The sanitised GCSE history syllabus. I think I did the Edexcel history exam at GCSE, if I remember correctly, which covers Elizabethan England, the USA and Nazi Germany, replaces slaves with enslaved people and Native Indians with indigenous people. Meanwhile, mention of Gypsies has become Roma and Sinti, and Jews has become altered to Jewish people. I don't know a single Jewish person who worries about being called a Jew or the Jews or Jewish people. Max, what do you make of this? How
utterly pathetic. I mean, I talk about, they're just words, okay? And I think my concern is that...
But there are words that are deeply offensive.
No, there are. But again, what we're doing in this continued pursuit of liberalism and wokeism is that we're just mollycoddling young people. And actually, there are unpleasant characters out there. History is a very unpleasant time. You look about those things. And we shouldn't be, sort of mollycoddling and putting bubble wrap about these subjects. They are very serious things. And just to change some words, I think it's very pathetic.
Andy, immigration is a thing, homosexuality is a thing.
Confirmed.
Is it confirmed? So, why not? Why not just use those words? Why not just call it what it is?
No, I do think this is a bit silly.
Yeah.
I really do. I mean, you've used two really good examples there. Changing slaves to enslaved peoples doesn't seem to me to be a
it's sort of sanitising the whole experience of slaves as well.
But I don't think it says anything other than someone at Edexcel is either bored or a bit of an idiot. I don't think it actually says anything about some kind of great assault on, or gosh, woke, all this nonsense that Liz Truss saying, oh, everyone, and I mean, Max talking about the continued pursuit of liberalism as if that's a bad thing.
Okay.
Sounds good to me.
We could be here for a while in the continued pursuit of liberalism, but